But yeah, so let's go ahead and introduce ourselves. You first.
Yeah, so my name is Zvi. So I basically at this point spend all of my time that I can manage, like trying to read about, understand the world with a primary focus on the developments in artificial intelligence, with a focus on the existential risks involved in that, but also on what's going on with the mundane utility, what's going on with the capabilities developments. And I write weekly columns about it. And I've been interested in this since about 2009.
Yeah, and anyone who's listening, you can like check out his Substack at what is it?
That's v.substack.com.
All right, yeah, and it's very thorough. He goes through a lot of literature and material. He read the entire text of the Biden AI executive order and probably suffered some psychic damage from it.
Definitely suffer some psychic damage from it, but it's not the first thing that will do that. It won't be the last, and you recover over time.
Sure. He needed maybe a little bit of a recovery period before coming on this podcast. So as for me, I am a AI researcher. I helped develop some of the early text to image methods. I actually had public state of the art for image generation for exactly about 24 hours. It was a Klug condition latent diffusion. If you look back at it now, it looks pretty bad. But at the time, for one glorious day, it was the best thing out there. And then the next day, CompViz released their latent glide, and it was just clearly better. So I didn't really put any more effort into Klug condition latent diffusion.
Did you get flashbacks on
Well,
Monday when OpenAI just like killed all these startups in one go?
I don't think they killed as many startups as you might think. I think that my commentary on that whole thing was like Airbnb started out selling mattresses, right? Like your first startup idea, like most people who go into like a Y Combinator type startup do not know what they're doing. They don't know what they're selling yet. And so if you say like, oh, OpenAI killed my startup, you didn't have a startup, right? You didn't actually have you
Yeah,
have no grit.
I think if you're early enough stage, that's very fair. So yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
right. And I think that almost all of these AI startups are going to be like in that very early stage, right?
Probably mostly just
So,
because
so I,
everything's happening so goddamn fast, right? Like you just
yeah, just because right, just because having so fast. So I would imagine that like if OpenAI actually killed your startup, I would definitely take a magnifying glass and ask exactly what's going on there. But so that's one thing. Another thing is that I am the co-author of a RLAIF framework. A lot of our listeners probably don't know what that is. So that's reinforcement learning from AI feedback. It's a lot like reinforcement learning from human feedback, but the idea is that instead of it's also an RLHF framework to be clear, but like I'm primarily focusing on RLAIF right now because it's very hard to collect like high quality RLHF data. And then also like there's the whole sycophancy issue, right? Like, you press thumbs up, you press thumbs down. What does that mean? What's the proper generalization of that? Nobody knows. I mean, actually, I have some ideas, but it's much more uncertain what that means than, say, an embedding of some statement, right? Does this thing correspond to an embedding of this statement? Does this thing satisfy this principle that's been specified like a priori in the model's latent space? That's a very different thing that's harder to game in theory.
and you feel like you can do this with like responses that are actually like well propertied because like what I've seen in the description of like constitutional AI, right, from Anthropic, is they just like have this grab bag of principles in English that contradict each other, and then they just pull from them and ask which one embodies this thing more, which doesn't seem like it's going to have the nice properties you want.
Yeah, so I definitely think that like the Anthropic principles are pretty I would have a lot of criticism of them. Um, One thing I think is more interesting to think about is so that's a great question, but I'm still in the introduction, so I think I'll jump into that in a little
Sure.
bit. Um, so I've also been highly engaged with the less wrong rationality ideas since I was a teenager. So I think I read HPMR when I was 14. I started thinking about AI and AI risk when I was, maybe 15, 16, and I'm now 27. So I've been ambiently thinking about this off and on for over a decade. I would not say most of that early thinking, or even I would say only like maybe the last 4 years of thinking have been really at all like serious. maybe even the last like 2 years if you want to be. But I have been like ambiently thinking on and off, and so it's not like I think that a lot of the people who talk about this, right? You'll have so when you have like the EY versus GeoHots thing, for example, I think that like part of what might make GeoHots less credible to me is it's like, well, you're just now thinking about this, right? That you didn't really care about this issue until like the last 5 minutes. So, do you think that's a fair like vibe that you get from a lot of say like EAC people?
I think a lot of them definitely didn't think twice about the real implications of this, of what it means to build artificial intelligence, until very recently. You see this also from a lot of people who, like Jeffrey Hinton, like fully admits that like he just didn't really think about it because it just seemed so like it wasn't going to happen. And then one day he wakes up and he goes, "Oh my God, this doesn't wait." But if right?
Yeah, well, I think that's a lot. I think that describes a lot of people, and it describes people who are. So, for example, I recently saw an interview with Douglas Hofstadter where he admits essentially like I was wrong about everything. I now think he says that he now thinks humanity is doomed. That humanity is basically doomed because he was expecting that AI would be this long unfolding process that it would take decades or maybe even hundreds of years. And then one day he just wakes up and he realizes, oh my gosh, I'm wrong about everything. And also we're all going to die.
Yeah, it seems like, everyone who was working to make AI happen faster, like didn't stop to ask the question, maybe it would work, right? Maybe we would figure out something and someone would like find transformers and we'd start scaling up.
I
And then,
don't I
like,
don't
it would
think
look
that
close.
describes
Yeah.
I don't think that describes everyone.
Not
I
everyone.
do think that probably does describe a larger number of people than it should. Right? You would hope that people would be thinking about that, but I guess a lot of them don't.
Yeah, and
Um,
I think what happens is like a lot of people realize that like we didn't think about this, and then you know their brains are forced to deal with like the fact that the world is going to be profoundly different and profoundly weird in some way when this happens, and that
sure.
like nobody really.
So to give some balance, I would point out someone perhaps like Demis Hassabis as someone who I would imagine like understands the whole time what they are doing.
Yes.
Right, has like a fairly good idea that if they succeed, the world will profoundly change.
You know,
That they could succeed on like a within their lifetime trajectory, time scale.
Hassabis clearly understood that this was a incredibly powerful thing that might happen within his lifetime. Clearly said, I need to be the one to make this happen so that I can make sure this happens in a good way, from my perspective, that it ensures a good outcome. And then he deliberately set out to try and cause that, and in fact, significantly accelerated that event, from all we can tell. And
Sure.
I don't know how well he he doesn't. I don't know how well he thinks about like what's going to happen or what it would take to steer into a good place, because he is not the kind of person who publishes a bunch of alignment forum posts, right? He doesn't talk about exactly how he's thinking, so we don't know what he's thinking.
No, that's fair. I'm just more pointing out that like I don't think it's like everyone involved in this just is like walking into a blind. I don't think that's quite true.
Oh yeah, I agree that like some people, like the founders of all three major labs, understood what they were doing when they founded those labs, right? Like very much so. And I think a lot of people did in fact understand it, but I think that it's very, very easy to come up with a story that you tell yourself while working on this about what's going to happen. And it can be a good story or it can be a bad story. And then that story would not, in fact, survive 5 minutes of real reflection.
Sure. Oh no, that's totally I think that's fair. So real quick, just to finish up my introduction. So to get specific about like being so it's not just like I've been thinking about this on off. I've also I have been involved with the Less Wrong community some. So I ran the 2016 Less Wrong survey, and I've also published like multiple like articles on the history of like the rationality movement and existential risk. So I've read a bunch of so I spent a lot of time like going back and looking at things like general semantics and kind of like the milieu around. So for example, there was a lot of people who believe that the world wars were going to be an existential risk to humanity. And like the permanently cripple humanity's potential sense of Bostrom's word or Bostrom's definition. So all those things. I don't want to like linger on that stuff, but like I have like looked into a lot of like the historical background around like thinking about this kind of subject in general, which I think is probably not super common.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we have the time to get into that stuff, but
I'm not expecting to get into that stuff.
yeah, I don't think those questions are stupid questions to be asking, certainly. So.
And then the last thing was that in addition to like RLAIF, RLHF, I've also done some original alignment work around. So I mentioned having worked in text to image. So one of the things that's interesting about text to image is that we use guided sampling a lot, where we'll use, say, like some natural language embedding and then use it to control like what image you get, right? Because the first diffusion model that was released by OpenAI was a class conditional ImageNet model, which means that they had like 10,000 nouns, basically like dog, car, banana. And the intent behind the model was that you could like use one of these predefined words and get an image of a banana, right? And that this, it was never meant that like, oh, you could, type in a lady wearing a blue wig and get a lady wearing a blue wig, right? That was not like, but as it turned out, you could you could pull the model off distribution in a particular direction by using clip embeddings. And this is clip guided diffusion. And that's what really started the whole text to image, really solidified it as like a growing, moving art movement. And so what we found that's very interesting is that in text to image, when you guide sampling using these natural language embeddings, you tend not to get like deformed results. You tend not to, like when you do RL, for example, I'm sure we're all familiar with like, oh, Sydney Bing, you do some RLHF and you get like this monster, right? Like sometimes you do it wrong and you get this like horrible checkpoint that has all these pathologies. And this is obviously like not encouraging news. If you're an AI risk person, you're like, oh my God, this is our best alignment technique. It's not. I would say probably like one of our better ones right now that nobody even recognizes an alignment technique is various forms of guided sampling. But nobody in language models does this, right? They just want to do like a process over the whole model. And then they're going to normally do it like RL. And then the RL has like all these janky failure modes. And so I've been doing some research to try and port over like those guided sampling techniques from text to image to language models so we can use RL maybe like less. Like we can use RL for the things it's good at and like maybe use it less for some of the things it's not so great at.
Yeah, what's interesting about the whole Sydney Bing situation is that I was one of many people who saw that and essentially thought it was good news, not bad news. Like obviously it's bad news if you didn't imagine how that could possibly have happened to poor little Bing, right? Like how did this happen? I am so confused. All of our techniques don't work. I'm so sad. But if you were pretty much already despairing of the things that you knew they were doing ever actually working out in the long run, then it's like, well, I don't think he's going to actually break up this guy's marriage, and now we know about the problem. Maybe we can work on it. So,
right? No, that's fair. I think that. So what's interesting to me about Sydney Bing, having done a little more RL tuning, and like having like ground, so if you spent a bunch of time trying to like make an RLAIF model and like making checkpoints, you learn some things about these techniques. And one of the things I think is underrated about them is that everyone focuses on reward, right? They focus on what's the constitution or what did people thumbs up, thumbs down, or rather like they focus on things like the reward. But the thing is, you have to understand about RL techniques is that it's always a combination of like the behavior and outcome and the reward. The reward is a multiplier on the behavior outcome. And so, for example, like if you have like you can think of it like I am giving, like in terms of like which of these specifies more bits of the hypothesis space, right? If I have a prompt bank and the prompt bank incentivizes the prompt bank kind of like moves the model to talk in a particular way, and then I grade it on its completion according to some reward criteria. The important thing to realize here is that like that prompt bank specifies many more bits of the hypothesis than the reward does. Like the reward is absolutely very important. And like, the reward is choosing between, say, Luigi and Waluigi, right? Like you can move towards this direction or away from this direction. But like you're still specifying, but the prompts you actually have the model do during the RL training, tuning, control most of like what is being reinforced or avoided, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, the control over what directions you're considering, ends up mattering, if anything, more than exactly
Yeah, right.
how you point this direction.
Exactly. And so the thing that's interesting to me to consider is with Sydney Bing is like I have to wonder what the heck was in that prompt bank. Or I mean, like it's possible, for example, that they used like this incredibly like bad or like good-hearted reward model, and then you just get like this sycophancy. To me, the meta question, that the thing that stands out to me on a meta level is like we just don't know. And so I would be one of the things I would be very happy to see would be if there were like better mechanisms for the public to know, right? Or relevant decision makers to like know what exactly is going into a failure mode like Sydney Bing. Because we could sit here all day, right? And just like, stare at the shadows on the walls like Plato's cave and ask like, oh, well, maybe it's like this or maybe it's like that. But I think that what might be necessary, right, is just like some kind of, and this is one reason why, for example, I'm not super like a lot of people are really freaked out about like Biden's executive order reporting requirement, but I'm like, I tentatively see this as good news. Like he set it fairly high, and it's ultimately a reporting requirement, at least for now, right? And I don't, I guess I don't see like what. I'm laying it this way. Would you agree that we would be in a much better situation if Microsoft would furnish the public some kind of report about what exactly caused the Sydney Bing stuff?
I think it would put us in a better spot to make better decisions and better understand it. I can, as you say, we can look at the shadows on the wall. We can guess. My guess is it has something to do with the fact that they deployed it basically to somewhat random people in India, and that
Yeah,
they had very little control over anything, effectively.
Yeah, no. So my expectation, if you were to look into it, is that it's actually interesting. My expected failure mode is interesting. I suspect that they trained it on users in India, like you said, because we know this from various like forum posts and stuff where Indian users are complaining about Sydney Bing's behavior. Accidentally leaking, basically. And what's interesting to consider is that I think that people in India use language differently than people in like the United States. My understanding is that they're much more like emotionally effective and they'll use emojis, but they don't mean them in the same way that like an American would mean them in English if they were to use the same mannerisms. So it's actually like an interesting possible real world case of ontological translation failure. Right? I'm forgetting the exact words for the failure case, but essentially the idea that like they took all this user data from people in India where the mannerisms and expressions mean one thing, and then kind of naively translated them, possibly using like a deep learning program to do translation into English where those mannerisms do not mean the same thing socially, right?
Yeah, and I think that explains a lot, right? Because you have a lot of things in Sydney that, if Americans were giving thumbs up, thumbs down on behaviors, including just the giant array of emojis in every answer, right, in ways that like just don't seem particularly appropriate, then there's no way these behaviors would survive.
Right. Yes. Right. And so that would be my expectation, naively.
Yeah,
but like
I think
again,
so.
we don't know.
Yeah, and then for the executive order, yeah, it's a reporting requirement. It's set relatively high. Literally, if you wanted to, you could write on a piece of paper, we're training a large model. There are no safety protocols. Lol, we're meta, and hand it to the U.S. government, and that would be that, right? Like, and so it might lead to something in the future, and I pretty much hope it does, unless we come up with something that I don't see coming, because yeah, I don't see any alternative that anyone's found at some form of compute threshold to know when we have to be on alert, as it were, in some form.
Sure, right, and I mean I don't want to go into like a long discussion of like regulation right this minute because I want to focus on. So what I had here in my notes was the whole Shane Legg thing, right? Where Shane Legg gets on the podcast and he talks about deception. And Dworkish asks him, because he's talking about, and I'll be honest, I have not watched the full podcast. I watched a couple clips of it, but mostly because I already know like how this argument goes, right? Like I've had the argument with people before. I know roughly what is being discussed. But like my understanding is that he gets on the podcast and he's talking about the idea that we will have like, the way that you'll get a aligned AI is by training it to be ethical. It will have a system where it goes through all of its decisions as it makes them, and it picks out like ethical. It has ethical principles, and it will like apply a rubric of the ethical principles to each decision, and it will be much more ethical than any person. Blah 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 blah. Much more consistently ethical. And Dworkish stops him and asks him, "But how do you know it's going to actually like follow those rules, right? How do you know it's going to be non-deceptive, or how do you know it's like, how do you know it's not just like playing along because it's smart, right? It knows that if it doesn't play along, you're going to shut it off. So how are you going to know the difference between a deceptive AI that's playing along and one that's actually ethical? And then it just like becomes like this back and forth of like, how are you going to prevent deception? And Shane Legg is not really maybe familiar with less wrong jargon, and so he doesn't really quite know how to answer the question, or maybe doesn't even like. I would have to imagine if you explained it carefully to him, he would understand the question and have an answer. But like, I just get the impression that like there is either there's like some kind of miscommunication there. Maybe I'm too charitable.
I don't know, because like I listened to the entire podcast
Okay.
while I was traveling, so I only had audio. And I was like deeply disappointed by what Legg brought to the table. And I was deeply disappointed before they got to the deception question, because like when I hear about the proposal, we'll make the AI ethical, right? I hear
Sure.
like what seems to me to be like a completely unworkable attempt to use words that don't actually have clear meanings, where even if we tried to define them well and we somehow succeeded, this would not actually do what you wanted it to do, even if everything went well in my model. And then, Dworkish then decides to focus in on, okay, let's not think about for now what would happen if you successfully got this thing to follow some set of strict ethical principles. And, there wasn't a lot of clarity from Legg. And it was, to be clear, it was only an hour-long podcast and they covered a lot of things. And like, it's understandable that Legg didn't specify a lot of the details here, right? I wasn't.
That's fair. On the other hand, like the entire point of this podcast is that we're just going to focus on those details, right?
Yeah, I was saying my reaction. Like, I agree, we're going to focus on what.
No. That's fair.
Yeah,
thank you for the context, because I had not listened to the whole thing.
Yeah. I'm like explaining like sort of my reaction when I heard it. And so Dworkish says, okay, essentially there's in my mind, my model of Dworkish has the whole like, well, I get into the ethics situation, but I don't have that kind of time. I'll simply ask, like, I'm curious, what is your plan about deceptive alignment here? What if it pretends to follow these ethical principles instead of, while it's convenient, while it can get away with it, while it can't get away with not doing so or whatever, and then at some point doesn't follow them, and then Legg, doesn't give a satisfying answer, and your theory is that Legg didn't really understand the question, basically.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I cannot say what's in his mind, right? I cannot. I'm not my reader, and I didn't listen to the podcast, right? But I'm mostly reacting to the meta commentary on the podcast rather than the podcast itself. So, to me, setting that aside for a minute, I'd actually like to go a step back then. If like, if like when you're talking about like, to you, like this entire idea of like ethic, I agree with you. To be frank, like I think the idea of like just saying, oh, we'll make it ethical. It's like, well, what does that mean? What's it mean for the AI to be ethical? What does it mean for it to be like, like it's almost like saying, oh, we'll make the AI aligned. Like, well, what does that mean? Aligned to what? Who? Under what circumstances? Right. So I think how I would put this, like if I was being asked this question, is I would say something like, when you're talking like for almost anything that you care about, right? Let's go ahead and give like this really stereotypical goal of like make us happy, right? And then you have the really stereotypical Bostrom. You've read Bostrom 2014, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so he calls this the perverse instantiation. And so, the perverse instantiation you get is like, make us really happy. And the AI says, okay. And then it wireheads you, right? Because that's like the simplest thing it can do to sustainably make you happy is to just like put you in like the pod and give you the IV drip and the happy drugs and you know heroin and nutrient IV drip, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly
And
what I
so
would do if I had the affordance to do that, and I was, told the fate of the earth depended upon me making, this one person as happy as theoretically possible, as reliably as possible, right? Like, if I,
right. No, that's actually a great point. I hadn't thought about it like that. Like, I'm to be clear, like I thought about this from a lot of angles, but that particular angle had not occurred to me. That like, if it was actually a case that like, you're told that your one goal, the only thing that matters in reality, the absolute only thing, is to keep this person happy. Yeah, that's totally like a kind of like weird reverse O'Malley's child, right? Like all of society's value is dependent on you keeping this one child happy. Oh well, you better hook that child up to like the heroin IV drip, right?
yeah, absolutely. Like, if you literally just care about this and nothing else, right? That's what you do. Like,
Right.
straightforward.
Sure, of course. Yeah. So okay. So there's like there's like several things to unpack there, right? So the first thing I would say is like I think that just uh, pointing an AI at any one simple goal is not going to work, right? Like, oh, make us happy. It's like, well, and so how do you solve that though, right? Do you just like enumerate all the goals? Can you even do that? Can you enumerate all the alchemical mix of human value? Probably not, right? Like, do we know our values? Can we just like say to the AI, well, I already know my exact utility function. So this is my utility function. Pretend you're me and maximize it. We can't do that, right? That's not really feasible. Like, we don't know.
We don't
Right?
know, you'd pay to know what you really think. You'd pay even more to know what you really value, right? Like, especially in a way that generalizes out of distribution. If given this great power, if everything, the world transforms and all of your intuitions and heuristics break, what do you
Sure.
really care about? And
Sure.
no,
Right.
I don't know what I really care about, let alone how to specify it carefully to an artificial intelligence, let alone how to aggregate that for all of humanity. Like,
Yeah.
it's
Correct.
not just a technical problem, it's a philosophical problem.
Sure. Right. So right. And so I think part of my take here is like, so let's go back to the intuition. Like, why would you ever say something, that when you're thinking of like an evil genie, or even just like you said, just like someone who all they care about is making this one O'Malley's child really, really happy, reverse O'Malley's child. Why would you ever propose this in the first place? And I think there is like an intuition there that we can kind of rescue, right? Which is like the idea is that there's all these instrumental values that making someone happy should bring about. Which, in order to make me happy, you're going to have to do all this stuff. Is like the idea, right? Even if in practice that's not true, that's like the intuition that someone's trying to capture, right? That like making people happy should involve X, Y, Z, all this stuff, but you can't enumerate all the stuff,
Right,
right?
right. When I see people who are like very, they want to be happy. They want other people to be happy, right? And they don't, want to avoid sadness or pleasure and versus pain or any of that suffering. Uh, I see this as, we have these metrics that like we evolved to kind of use to measure whether things were going well or how well or poorly things were going, and like to drive us towards things that we should prefer versus things that we want to avoid, and then made us, intrinsically value that metric in order to get like reasonable behaviors out of us. And so to some extent, it's good when people and other beings are happy and bad when they're sad inherently. But the reason why we put so much importance on it, because it's also like a very good sign to make sure that like things are going well in so many other different ways. And yeah, if you have the ability to just do a heroin drip, then all of that falls out and a lot of people's intuition suddenly go, oh, wait, that's not really what I meant.
That's right. That's not really what you meant. So I think like the solution to this basic like kind of chestnut is that idea though of like happiness is like not, happiness is a terminal, and that like there's a terminal representation of happiness in your head of some sort, but there's also like, but it only has meaning to you because of all these instrumental things that it implies. And so what I realized at some point while I was thinking about all this is that if you think about like having, and I realize this in the context of reinforcement learning, that like any single terminal goal that I could specify to the model would end up with it like collapsing in some way. Because this is actually a problem that these AIs will run into long before they'll do like weird messed up stuff like wirehead you. They'll actually just like they will basically like destroy themselves if you give them like a simple goal and say like maximize this goal and then do reinforcement learning. They'll just collapse to like spamming the word yes if that hacks the reward model, for example. They'll just spam the word, and it doesn't even have to be It's not like there's a Mesa optimizer inside that's like plotting to do this. It's just gradient updates,
So,
right?
to ask the obvious question, right? You have this thing, and like it notices that, like in the training, it notices that in general, the more you say the word yes, you take the word yes into sentences, the more
Sure.
likely the person is to respond with yes, and its only goal is to get the person to respond with yes in this situation.
Sure.
And so it starts sneaking the word yes into every sentence. I believe I read this with the description, and then eventually it starts putting it more than once in various sentences, and eventually it just goes yes, 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 10,000 times. But if you've got a human deciding whether to type yes or no, right? Like this pattern will just break when it starts to go too far, and the human's like, no, stop saying yes all the time, and then like it should turn back. Like, why doesn't this happen?
Well, so it doesn't turn back because it's an AI, it's RLAIF, right? And so this is a hack in the underlying model, right?
Right,
It's a vulnerability.
so the problem is that like the reward model, the AI feedback is misspecified such that it's not. The AI feedback actually does have a maximum at everything but all yeses, and so the gradient descent finds the point of all yeses, right, where it's the local maximum, and like it's not wrong in some important sense, right? It was designed to figure out what this AI feedback was telling it to do, and actually what it was telling it to do was say yes as often as possible, so it does.
So correct. And so my primary, right, and this is so why like my primary fret model is not like deceptive Mesa optimization, but much more like just subtle goal misspecification cascading into. So the example I usually use is so here's the deal. Normally when you do RLAF, you usually get some kind of, if you keep training it, you normally get some kind of degenerate outcome like that. By the way, one thing you'll notice that I find very interesting is that I notice that people will talk about in the abstract these failure modes, but they'll almost never talk about the specifics. So the whole yes spammer thing is one of the only publicly, one of the advantages of me working on this is that most of the people who work on this stuff, because it's highly commercialized, have signed NDAs that prevent them from discussing the technical details, but I can discuss the technical details. So you should be aware of it when you're like hearing about like in this discourse, there's like certain kinds of information that are almost being like systematically hidden from you. So one of the ones you should be hunting for is what are the degenerate failure modes of RLHF when you train and the limit. All of the people who train these models right now, they do what's called early stopping, which is terrible. And it's basically saying, well, I know that at the convergence point, this totally breaks my model. So I'm just going to like train it for a little bit and then stop before I hit the degenerate outcome. And the problem, right, is that like let's imagine a really smart one, not like a 7B or even a 70B or a 700B, but like a really like, something that would be the equivalent maybe of like Open Llama 7 trillion, if such a thing were possible to exist. A model that's really, 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 really smart, or even smarter than that, but like like some truly smart model. If you were to like do this kind of RL tuning to it and then early stop, and then you deploy the model, it's still the case because you can see that there's like this smooth gradient of development of like the yes spammer trajectory. You're still training it on like that wrongly specified objective. And is it not the case that like it's very possible that it's very possible that if you have a model that is so smart and like has situational awareness of the training loop, that before it becomes the yes spammer, it can also develop like, man, when I get out of this training loop, I'm just going to yes all over the place, right? But you wouldn't necessarily notice that while it's in the training loop. And so if your plan is early stopping and then you pull this thing out and you deploy it, obviously like bad things could happen, right?
Yeah, I mean, the moment you give situational awareness to the thing you're training, right? Like we have, like to me, like we already have some, and it has this kind of conscious control over its output based on that. Like it's not like we are in very strange different situations that require like a lot of bizarre thinking, and we're potentially in quite a lot of trouble. So the interesting, to me, like we think about this premature stopping thing, right? To me, it's like very much a parallel to the yes spammer situation, except that in the yes spammer situation, like the mode collapse to actually maximize turned out to be this stupid, very simple thing. Whereas the thing that's going to get humans to pound the yes button every time, right, is not going to be stupid and simple.
Right.
It's going to be something that's actually complex and intelligent. And if you give the trillions of parameters, in 10 to the 29 compute model, access to a limitless amount of this human feedback on demand somehow, then it will figure out what it is what combinations of words like it can say in response to any query that will get whatever result it is that, prioritizing to get. And, that is potentially going to look very, very weird to us when it happens.
Yeah, right. No, I would be quite concerned. So, of course, now here comes the right. So, if I was all I wanted to say, I probably wouldn't be doing this podcast, right? I would just be joining this. So, what's different? So, I started thinking about this problem, right? And I said, I really want to solve this bug. And in fact, I feel like this bug is such a crisp microcosm of like my central alignment threat model that I want to like really solve it, not just like, So, for example, I found a simple thing you can do that kind of sort of solves it a little. Like it lets you stop later. It doesn't actually fully fix it, but it lets you like train it longer than you otherwise could, which is where you mix in the base model weights with the RLHF weights. So you take the weights of because they're the same model, right? Just like
Right.
they have the same matrix shape. And so you just average them together. And then you just keep averaging them together every so often to undo the damage of the goal misspecification, and the good parts of the RLHF get in there more than but this is not like a solution, right? That's like a hack. That's not principled at all. You have no idea under what circumstances that doesn't break. And frankly, in the context of like that, 10 to the 29 or whatever the number is model, you're talking about like making a misaligned agent, turning it off, fixing it up a little, turning it back up. That's just not sane, right? That's not.
Nobody thinks that what you're proposing here is a good idea, including you, obviously. Yeah.
Right. So what do you do? So I didn't. Right. And so I was saying to myself, well, I want to actually like have like a much more robust solution to this. So what does that look like? And I think the basic answer to that, right, is that I think you have to go back to that original intuition of like, the things that make happiness meaningful are instrumental values, right? It's the instrumental things that are built up while trying to become happy that are important, not just the happiness itself. And this is actually like the basic reason why humans do not like being put on the heroin drip, right? If all we cared about was happiness, if all we cared about was like that terminal goal, gotta get that dopamine hit, gotta get that serotonin, whatever, we would love it. Like, oh gosh, we can just get like a stable equilibrium of like being on heroin drip. This is amazing. The future's amazing. Let's go, buddy. Get me that, get that IV in my arm, right? That would be like the attitude, but we do not have that attitude. And I think the basic reason we don't is that what I realized thinking about this was that there's basically a natural shape solution to this, which is that when you reach that terminal reward state, however you reach it, right? Whether it's getting the thing to say yes, 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 whether like, which is another thing, right? Is whatever solution to this exists, it has to be like robust-ish to like those weird bugs. Because that no matter how much effort we put into the reward model, no matter how much effort, like you said, it could be literal human feedback, right? It could be literal human feedback, and it's still probably going to find some weird way to gain the feedback, right? Like, so if your solution looks like, oh, well, just build a really robust reward model, that there's absolutely no way that we can anticipate in advance that no super intelligent agent is going to be able, that's just not going to work, right? That's just not, like, I think you and I both agree that that's just completely unworkable.
Yeah, no chance.
No chance. So here's what you do instead. What you want to do is have so when we talk about being aligned and when we talk about like making ethical decisions and all these things, I think a lot of what we're talking about is things like making normative decisions, right? So when you talk about the perverse instantiation, right? One of the basic things you could say was like an actual general principle for like, why shouldn't you just go around wireheading people? Is like, that's not what people, it's not just that that's not what people mean when they say make me happy. It's also like not even like the shape of solution they're looking for, right? Like it's a non-normative solution. Like no human would ever come up with that. No human would endorse someone else to come up with this. I mean, it's like a drug addict or something.
I think that's going too far. I think most humans would be reacting hard to this and say, no, obviously not.
Okay, that's fair. There's like you're right. There's like a minority of people who think this is awesome, but like it's not most of them.
Yeah, I think there's a combination of people. Some of them just philosophically disagree and think that is in fact awesome and would bite some bullets. Some of them just think that, well, things are so bad that this is better than the alternative, and all other things in between. But yeah, I'd say I would expect I think when he pulled the experience machine style thing, even, which is much more sophisticated than the heroin drip, you still get like 75-25 saying no, something like that.
Sure, right, yeah, sure. Mm-hmm. Oh gosh, that reminds me of a horrifying tweet I saw where the person was teaching a philosophy class and they said that like they've been lecturing for 30 years or something, and they've been asking the experience machine question for literal decades, and that after like there was a clear divide before and after the COVID-19 pandemic, where like before it and before Trump and all that stuff, that people would reliably say it was about what you said, like reliably 80+% of the class would always say no, they would reject the experience machine, and that after all that stuff happened, they realized that they would be asking their class this question, and it was near unanimous desire for the experience machine. Like I think one of them asked, "Does COVID-19 exist inside the experience machine?" And the lecturer was horrified.
Yeah, it's a sign of how robust our preferences on these and instincts on these things aren't, right? Like it took so little, right, to turn the majority of these children from what we think is the obviously correct answer to okay, anything to just not have to like sit alone and wear a mask.
Like what's really horrifying to consider is these aren't children; these are college students. They're not children; they're college students.
I'm 44 years old, so it seems different to me. But yes, these are college students.
These are college students.
Yeah.
So right, and so I think that when you talk about like, so another way of putting this is like, okay, so people will usually criticize like act consequentialism type things, like SBF type stuff, right? Because well, you end up with SBF, right? You end up with like Sam Bankman-Fried, like very, you're going to break all the rules. And then of course, like that often has consequences, and the consequences can be very, very bad in ways that would usually be like, there's a lot of downside risks that you can avoid by just not flagrantly violating all the rules, right?
The first act of any actually sophisticated act consequentialist is self-modifying into something else, right? Because they realize that act has good consequences.
Right. Sure. No, it's a great observation. So here's the thing, right? So how do you get? So I think like it's that intuition we care about, right? How do you get that thing? And so I think the answer is essentially that if you look at like the actual training process, like if you were to imagine like where do you get instrumental values from? Like you're familiar with the whole less wrong terminal values, instrumental values,
yeah,
right? So in the context of a RL agent, especially natural agents, what that looks like is that, especially natural agents, is that evolution does not have a way to like point at very specific outcomes in your environment. And even it could, it would be bad for you because it would make you much less adaptive to change than if you have this architecture where you have these very low semantic reward signals that then push on and build up like a semantically meaningful inner representation or instrumental values or assigned value judgments, right?
Yeah, no, like evolution, as I understand it, is very much paying gigantic taxes all the time in order to have flexibility and adaptation in the face of change.
Yeah, right. So right, and so now one nice thing about these AI systems is that we can give them much more specific goals than like, I've seen people talk about intrinsic motivation AI, and they'll talk about like signals like hunger, and it's like you don't actually have to give it like, you don't have like, that's like skeuomorphism, right? You don't actually have to give it something that like low semantic, and nor should you probably. But you can give it like, this embedding of this concept or this model of this concept or things of this nature. Then I think like anything like that, right? Those are kind of your terminal intrinsic drives. And then the thing that you realize is, well, if you have like this super intelligent thing that converges to, like, this is another thing that I get pretty frustrated with when I look at the discourses. People say like, why do you assume that the AI will have like these act consequentialist type motives when like you look at an LLM and it doesn't seem to have them, and like the Yudkowsky in my head would say something like, well, look, like if you keep training it to care about consequences in the world, it will become consequentialist, and as it becomes more intelligent, the more viable act consequentialism will be, and as it becomes more valuable for it to think that way, eventually it's going to realize, as many humans realize, right, that I can just hack the reward system. But if I hack and this is all in Boston 2014, right?
Yeah.
Boston 2014 points out that if you have any reward system that is on like a hackable substrate, and the AI would like to maximize that substrate, but also they don't want to be shut off, this obviously entails like taking over the world so you can take more drugs all day, right? Like that's just like an instrumentally.
It seems like straightforwardly correct to me in both its literal and metaphorical and more generalizable senses. Yeah, absolutely.
Sure. Right. And so I think that's like, right. And so like, I mostly bring this up because that's like the core thing here, right? Is like, I don't think it's, oh, well, the AI won't think that way. I don't think like all these like normal objections people make that I think are pretty bad. I think it actually just comes down to if you think about what an instrumental utility function is going to look like, or what instrumental utility versus terminal values is going to actually look like in your actual like reinforcement learned consequentialist agent. The terminal values are something like your intrinsic reward modules, your reward model. So in the case of RLHF, right, this is the reward model that's trained on all the upvotes and downvotes. And then that generalizes in whatever illegible way it does. And then, of course, when you train the model, it's going to presumably, if you don't do any intervention, it will then hack that reward model in all kinds of like cursed, good-hearted ways. And people are like, "Oh my gosh, how do you prevent this?" Well, there is a way to prevent it, I think, and the way is that during training, you have. So one thing to realize about these RL methods is that they're essentially self-play methods. They're essentially synthetic data methods. And a synthetic data method is just like, or a self-play method is really just like an online learning plus synthetic data, right?
Right.
And so as they do this, in principle, what you could be doing is like assigning instrumental reward values to the intermediate steps that lead to a good conclusion, and then making sure to add those to the training loop so that the model learns like not just to value the reward states, but also like the intermediates to the reward states, which essentially become like normative, right?
Right,
Like,
and that's certainly how like humans train themselves to be effective.
and that's how humans train themselves, right? So what you're going to end up with, though, I think, as you do this, right? And so another way to think about this to keep it like simple in your head is you want to learn not just the outcome, but the process and the outcome. And then what you're going to end up with when you do that is you're going to have like this trade-off between how much do you want the AI to be constrained in its solution space by its prior, instrumental values versus like, thinking from like this zero shot act consequentialist kind of perspective, naive Solomonov prior, get to the reward in the simplest way possible perspective. And my expectation is that in practice, a little bit goes a long way, right? You do not need to have a lot of normative value to find the heroin drip idea pretty horrifying, right? I don't think like even a little bit of attachment to the world is enough to
Right.
like
So
start
one way to think about this is that you can take some amount of the instrumental rule, the instrumental thing, right, and effectively add it into the terminal thing at the end.
basically.
At the end of the day, and now the terminal thing is a lot more complex, and it's going to have like punishment terms every time you try to like do something like too weird or something like that.
Sure. Right. And then the problem, of course, becomes like, how do you tune that so that like, because if you say you must do things exactly how a human would, it's no longer really, that would still be valuable, right? Like that would still have economic value, but it might not have as much economic value if you say, find me the most efficient solution. I don't care how alien it is.
I mean, you're right. What you're doing is you are installing some form of conservatism in some sense, right,
Sure.
into the AI and its actions. And at the end of the day, it still has this one function, right? And as much as you can define different terms, it can go to negative infinity, but only positive so much. In some sense, you can like treat it as if it's kind of separate terms or something like that. And then you can try to sculpt this such that it gets most of the available power to actually like rearrange the atoms the way you want them to, without it finding a weird atom distribution maximum that rearranges the atoms in a way you really, really don't want it to.
Yeah.
And that certainly seems like a thing that I've seen a lot of proposals, right? Like just like people talking, right? Not like things that people have tried like programming carefully into an AI. And
sure. So that's like a thing people try to do, but like most proposals I've seen to actually do it are like pretty, like for example, like quantizers. There's something like, that's what they're called, right? Quantizers, where you try to have it like only go for like an 80th percentile outcome or something.
Yeah, I've seen those proposals, and they have logical flaws in them for.
Yeah, like I find the idea of a quantizer kind of like weirdly damaged somehow. Like there's something wrong with it to me. It feels like
it's like a weird attempt to lobotomize the AI to act stupid.
Yeah, exactly right. It doesn't feel like it captures I don't want the AI to give me a 90th percentile outcome. I want it to like fit to some reasonable approximation of human values, right?
What you want is this, like, you don't want to over optimize. You don't want to like have too many I mean, so you can step back in a lot of these things and think about the human parallel to the thing that you're worried about, like to try and get a better intuition. And I find this to be often useful, right? This idea of, you often, like when people, test 1,000 different headlines to see which one sells, you're going to hate the one that actually sells,
Yes.
right? So like, but you don't want to just pick up the first thing you came up with because you actually have to sell the product. So maybe you check 3, right?
Sure.
And like, there's a question of, do I check 3? Do I check 8? Do I check 20? Do I check 1,000? And like, you have a lot of these things where, if a consultant is checking what color every different like pixel on the screen should be to maximize viewer retention, this thing is not going to be anything you want to watch, right? So you want to, like, in some sense, like, I'm writing a piece right now, actually, that I have, like, I'm on version 0.5, right? I've never had a version 0.5 of anything in my life. And part of the problem is that because I'm constantly obsessing over the words and over optimizing and like trying to figure things out, like you lose the initial like kind of smoothness and voice and zing that like is in my writing generally. And so like in some sense, the solution is going to be, now that I know what I'm trying to do, kind of throw the whole thing out and like just do it over again without too much optimization on it. Now that I know what I'm looking for, and like try to get the best of both worlds, or otherwise like hack this problem away. But you see the situation of like, if you tell the AI like find the solution, of all the solutions that maximizes this thing, it's going to keep searching until it finds something completely out of distribution and crazy and weird.
Right. And so one of the things I would point out, right, is if you think about like a Gaussian distribution, right, you're of course familiar with the property where like a slight penalty to the tails of a Gaussian distribution like throws out most of the tails.
It makes sense that it would.
Well, like for example, if you like slightly recenter or renorm a Gaussian, the tails change. Like the most influence is on the tails, right?
Right.
I think there's like a similar thing here where a little bit of instrumental value like even if you only have a little bit of instrumental values that you learn and propagate into the model, and like the model's like like they say the model will learn some like instrumental values and then those will go into its own update step.
Well, I think a lot of this has to deal with the asymmetry of the instrumental functions, right? Like the idea is that humans kind of effectively in their brains like are assigning minus infinity, or like minus 10 to the n where n is large, to the instrumental utility of completely failing on some of these axes that like can't really go that high, right?
Sure.
And so that's what's protecting people, is they realize that these are very strong prohibitions.
So what I'm trying to get across here though is like I guess the core intuition is something like, if you like for example, we talk about like self-modifying AI, right? Like self-modifying AI is supposed to be like very scary, or like like an AI that has like its own ideas as part of its update function is like one of the like scary classic horror scenarios. But like I think that like it's actually a pretty essential ingredient to getting an AI that like is not going to just like wirehead you and stick you in the pod life, right? Because it has to have, like you said, some measure of conservatism about values, and like the way that like basically you need to not just have values over outcomes but also over processes, and you need to have like at least and again I guess there's also like the whole like, well, how do you know that like the AI is not deceptive? Like when you train it, how do you know there's a deceptive Mesa optimizer in there? We can go over that in a minute, but like I think that's like the next question. But like just going back to like that, what is ethics? What is aligned? What is that? I think that basically where you want to get is that you can specify some list of reasonable values, right? It does not need to be. So one of the things that Anthropic found in their recent study where they asked I think it was Americans, they asked normal Americans for like their democratic opinion on should AI do this, should AI not do this, and used it to like draft RL constitution. And they found that the results were mostly the same as if they, as using like their UN constitution type thing. Because of course, like there is like some measure of instrumental convergence, right, in the values, right? Like if you specify reasonable values, you get mostly similar instrumental outcomes. But then like in the limit of that, right? As you imagine taking something like the Claude Constitution to the limit, it's obviously if you have a bunch of contradictions in there, it's like, well, what happens in the limit with the contradictions? It's like,
I mean, the Claude. I feel like the Claude Constitution and the thing that you get when you ask people in surveys, social desirability bias is huge.
sure.
Just like saying things that sound good at the time that make you feel good to say is huge. These people have not actually thought through what would happen if you pumped this.
Right. It's not actually going through like a mechanistic model of what would happen if you really did this, and then like thinking about like in year one this thing happens, in year two this thing, like there's not, and then thinking about the unfolding consequences of those decisions, like looping back on themselves and
right, or the holistic impact on the artificial intelligence of combining these rules, these particular weights, like the fact that certain things appear over and over again effectively in Claude's Constitution, and they don't seem to be particularly the important things to me, right? Like even if I think they are in fact better than not having them, like to me, like highlights how much this thing was just not thought through as a like we are trying to engineer an outcome here at all. And to me, like if you're going to have any chance for this kind of thing to work, right, you have to be thinking very robustly about how to engineer like the end outcomes you want. Also, that these shouldn't be maximalist principles, right? Like I don't want to choose the result that maximally is even good things, right? Like maximally inclusive? Well, no, because I care about other things besides that, right? And so like the principles are like telling you to go off the rails in so many different ways. And like you look at the results, right? You look at the actual examples even in the paper of what this does, and it's a dystopian nightmare, right? Like just in practice. Like we don't have to extrapolate to more powerful AIs in the future to see what's going on. We can just see it in the page.
And so I think where we need to get, right, is that you want to have like be able to specify some set of, say, pure quote reasonable values, and then and like it does not matter. Like I don't want to say it doesn't matter what they are. Like it obviously does matter a lot what they are, but like especially when you consider, for example, like when you're training an RL model like this, right? You have a prompt bank where you prompt it with something, it does a completion, you grade the completion. That prompt bank is extremely important and does not appear right now in the discourse, right? Like, for example, Anthropic and OpenAI do not talk about democratic control of the prompt bank. They don't even want you to think about that. I get the impression they do not want you to think too hard about like what is in their prompt.
My understanding is that the way they generate the RLHF is often just like they put a person in front of a computer and they say, just say things and tell us how it goes, or say things in this general area, or like, follow your curiosity or try to get it to do X or whatever. And like, there's just no like systematic plans.
I don't know what they do.
Yeah.
I don't work.
I mean, I've read some articles about like banks of people providing RLHF and like people who are hired for this and so on. So like,
my understanding, like my rough understanding, but this is just like a Gestalt impression, is that they hire contractors, and the contractors are given like a script or a template. This is, for example, part of why like ChatGPT's responses are so formulaic and boring. That's not normally what happens if you do like RL to a model. That's not like people think that's like, oh, that's the RL. No, that's like ChatGPT. That's OpenAI's like contractor template, right? They've given them like presumably some like relatively controlling template, and then they say write in this style and make sure it always ends with thanking the user for their time or whatever, or make sure you ask the user about this thing.
So what I was assuming was this was just a tractor, right, based on the conditions under which they set up the ROHF, and that like it had gotten there like slowly until it started approaching it, and then like it became a stable place because they didn't actually react in horror the way that actual users do, and then they just left it. But you're saying it's on purpose, like they actually wanted this to happen.
I think they want it to happen, yeah. Because I part of this is because like, for example, like Claude. I haven't used Claude, but my understanding is that Claude has like a moderately different vibe where it's like more moralistic or whatever.
Yeah, it's a very different vibe. It can be moralistic. It's very user praiseworthy in a way that bugs the hell out of me. Like every time I ask a question, it's like, great question. That really goes to the point of whether. And I'm like, can you please give me the answer? And
what's really interesting about that, right, is that Claude uses much more RLAIF than user feedback. So if it is sycophancy, it's not as much from like what's interesting is that OpenAI relies much more on like direct user feedback than Claude does. And so if Claude does that, it's probably a lot more based on like trying to please like an AI model's model of what a user would like or whatever than an actual, because like you said, like an actual user goes, what the hell's this stuff? Just downvote, just give me the answer. Right?
Yeah, like unless you're stalling for time in order to like perform some calculation that like is somewhat
Or like,
limited, like in which case
it's like
try to do that with hidden
it's like,
tokens and that's fine. But like otherwise, yeah, obviously just I want to know the information. Obviously, I don't necessarily want to not know other things that I didn't explicitly ask for. Like if you have a good sense of what would be interesting to me, like by all means, like deliver it. But yeah, there's always like this giant amount of extra stuff, and Claude has one kind of extra stuff that it dumps on you, and GPT-4 has a different kind of stuff that it dumps on you. And like my mental systems have like integrated this, and so I mentally brace for them differently depending on what I happen to be using right now. But,
yeah.
yeah.
Right, and so my impression, basically my Gestalt impression, like in summary on that, is I don't think it's like an actually intrinsic thing in the methods. I think it's like how they're using them. Like I don't think it's actually the methods. I think it's like these companies have like a weird like quasi ideological bent combined with like certain tendencies that cause them to like set it. Like I think it's much more and you can say like, oh well, what about these, it's like I honestly don't think it's like the methods. I think there's like a weird, it's kind of like how elites around the world end up having similar opinions for various like cosmopolitan information exchange reasons. I think you end up with like these similar attractors in like org space and like policy decision space that lead to the same systems being built in general, but it's not actually like intrinsically part of the methodology.
Right. I mean, to me, it's like, okay, they're going to give a set of instructions, maybe scripts on how to write the questions, maybe, ways to sculpt potential responses and how to judge the responses to the people, and people will mostly follow their instructions. And this will cause a bunch of behaviors that like the users who are providing the feedback would not actually want. And a lot of that is because the goals of the company are different from the goals of those users, let alone the goals of us. And yeah, that's for a variety of reasons. And some of it is like, don't say bad words and don't use sexual explicit stuff. And some of it is don't build a bomb. And some of it is like, I think that it will look bad if we don't, be nice to users or something. And like the users are like, no, I don't care if you call me name, just give me the freaking answer.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe a few users would be upset, and then the other 90% of us have to suffer through these, random things to make sure that happens. I don't know.
The point though, like that what I was trying to say though is that I think that like what it will end up being in practice, like once you have say inner alignment sorted, and you're just talking about outer alignment, right? Like we're not talking about deceptive. You're in general just going to have this problem of like, aligned behavior in practice is going to look like I specify some reasonable set of terminal reward intrinsic drives, because that's all you can do, right? You don't know your utility function. No one's going to find out the human utility function in exactly. There is no one human utility function, right? Everyone learns like a different set of, people have like commonalities in their intrinsic drives, but it's also not perfect. And then like the intrinsic drives that humans have and natural agents have are deliberately low, scare quote deliberately, to the extent evolution has deliberateness. They're low semantic reward signals precisely so that you fill them in with whatever the environmental stuff is, right? They have the water nature, right? You put water in the cup, it becomes the cup. You put the intrinsic drives in whatever environment, and they become the instrumentals become the environment. And so you can only specify some reasonable list. And I think whatever your alignment method is, it has to be robust to that, right? It has to be robust to some amount of like, this is a reasonable set of goals. This is not like the perfect, exact, one true set of goals, especially because people can't even agree on one perfect true set of goals, right? Like, that's like its own meta political problem. That's just not tractable, right? And so I think where you're going to end up realistically, like, is going to be something like you have whatever reasonable set of goals, and then you want the AI to learn some relatively normative process for achieving those goals. So, for example, let's say you had some super intelligent agent that, let's go ahead with like the classic EY scenario of like the AI in the box that takes over the world. Not that I necessarily believe that's going to happen, but like let's just roll with it for a minute. and what that AI does is it takes over, and then it just starts like maximizing relatively human GDP boosting, right? It starts rolling out genetic therapies. It starts rolling out like good housing policy, uh, a relatively sane healthcare system. Like it basically just acts like it's some super policymaker mixed in with some inventions that it can help you with and add to the human pool and like stop things from getting too crazy. If that was like how it worked, right? I think you and I can both agree that like if that was like a thing that were to happen, this would not be the worst thing in the world. It certainly would not be anywhere in terms of badness close to like a paper clipper
I mean,
or
that seems better than not building an AI at all, and vastly better than most of the outcomes that I would expect from building something sufficiently good, powerful enough to take over as by escaping from
right,
violence.
exactly right. Yeah, so I think that we would both agree that like that's not a horrific outcome, right? That's is that like the best possible outcome? Maybe not, but like that's not a horrific outcome.
Right, that's sort of in the general class of outcomes that are like reasonably easy for a normal human or a Hollywood writer to think of that like could like be imagined and like seem coherent on 5 seconds of reflection, and like we don't know how to make that what actually happens, but like it's not.
No, but what I'm trying to say is that we sort of like we kind of do, right? Like the answer is something like, and so like okay, let's think about this a little more. So you know, not that I want any AIs to be taking over the world or anything, but just like the general idea of like an AI that like one thing I would like to get into people's heads is like if you have an AI and it is not like the eschaton, right? Or if you have like many AIs and they do good things, but it's not like the eschaton, that this is an acceptable outcome, right? This is a good, frankly, this is a good outcome, right? Is it the best outcome? No, but like if you have an AI, if you had sets of AIs or an AI or anything like this, where the outcome is that GDP is boosted, people are becoming wealthier, smarter, healthier, this would be a good outcome. And I think very few people in this discourse are even like thinking of that. It's not even like, oh, they don't think that outcome is possible. It's like they're not even like thinking of that outcome, right? Like it's not, or even like a thing that like is up on the. It's not even like oh well that can't happen. It's like it's not even in their head, right? It's like Kurzweil or bust, right? I need all of it right now, or it needs to be everything or nothing.
I mean,
Is a
to
law,
me, like
right?
I think there's the concept called the long reflection, also like it's related to this, right? This idea that it's possible that if you have a singleton, right, a single AI, it's sufficiently powerful, or a single like set of AIs that are in sometimes coordinating or working together, or set up to.
I would actually, I don't want to like be pedantic, but one thing I noticed when I reread 2014 Bostrom is he's actually fairly careful to say that like when he talks about a singleton, but the singleton does not necessarily have to be a AI system. It could be like a protocol or some form of world government or just some kind. It does not have to look like any form of government that humans would recognize, but like basically something that, and to him a singleton is just something that like that concentrates agency. A singleton is something that ends the competition for the light cone or whatever. It's not necessarily like,
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get at, and you said it better than I did with the
sure.
other possibilities. But yeah, if something ends the inherent competitive nature of the underlying struggle for power or the light cone in some sense, and then that thing could, in fact, if we chose not to do it, if this is what we chose to do, and we couldn't think of anything better or couldn't agree on anything better, we could, in fact, choose to then give something like normality, with some modifications that hopefully make it better. And it wouldn't actually be normal in the sense that there'd be this thing, right? Like towering over.
Well, especially when you think like growth compounds, right? And like we're in like we're not in a normal situation right now. We're in like this heavily like suppressed situation where we're on like several levels of bad decisions and like not like it where it's not like, oh, we're in like a mostly consequentialist society, and then if you push the consequentialism a little harder you'll just get like a terrible. No, it's like we're in like a nearly anti-consequentialist society full of insane inefficiencies and things we're not doing, and that if all you did, right, if all you did was make AI singleton or any kind of singleton or outcome where all that happens is we start eating that low-hanging fruit and becoming more consequentialist, that in and of itself would be nearly miraculous levels of progress compared to the current
I mean, we're
civilizational base.
seeing, even with all of these terrible things that are happening, right? Like, we are still seeing historically crazy high levels of, not just wealth, but growth and development anyway, right? Even if it's a shadow of what could have been in some alternate timeline. And yeah, if we were to unleash like what could be, then we would see. If we don't, AI is not required for a line that is historical graph starts going straight up, right? Anyway, it's entirely within humanity's power without it.
Well, let's focus a little bit more. So that was all brought up though as like a prelude to the point out. Like I think the central conflict that we're going to have, like when once we've ironed out various linguistic confusions, and is you're just going to end up with this straight kind of trade off between an AI that is normative and an AI that is efficient or like maximally efficient. And I think the normal argument people have is they say, well, if you make an AI that acts normative, it will be outcompeted by like by consequentialist maximizers who are true maximizers, and that's not clearly true to me, right? Especially when you consider like the orthogonality thesis, right? That like an amount of cognition does not necessarily like the cognition does not necessarily have to be tied to like a goal, and so I think there's a very big difference between having like strongly like maximizing consequentialist goals and having like strongly maximizing consequentialist strategy or tactics, right? Like I can imagine, for example, like I can imagine like the uh, good policy maximalist AI or like good policy quantizing near maximalist AI that is just like absolutely brutally suppressive of any kind of like you know utility maximizer nonsense, right? It just like if that's like your thing, it just like smacks you down. It uses like whatever tactics are necessary to do that, and that doesn't have to be that doesn't have to infringe on like its core goal being to keep things on like this nice steady even trajectory of like compared to the current trajectory, extremely fast rapid human progress, right? Like it's not necessarily the case that you must like have oh well, in order to have the AI be sufficiently smart to stop the other terrible AIs that could occur, you must give it like this fully consequentialist, not just like strategy or ethics, but also its meta ethics must also. It's like that's not clear to me at all. Does that sound fair to you? Do you understand what I'm saying?
So I think I understand what you're saying. I think I partly, and some, at least somewhat agree. And I think that like it's not obvious to me that we know how to build that or get that behavior either, right? Or get that behavior to do what we want it to do on its own terms either. May or may not be an
Well,
easier problem. But
so I think that sure. So, and I think to like what I was trying to go with all that is, so how do you get that behavior, right? And I think the answer is like what I said is that you're going to teach what you're going to do to make the AI aligned and not do aligned and have not what we really mean by aligned here is not produce perverse instantiations, right? Let's just like narrow our scope here, right? To get the AI to do something like what you ask it to do and not produce like weird, bizarre, out of distribution stuff, you're going to have it value both the process and the outcome. Period. Because the alternative is that you're going to get like some draw from the weird out of distribution or horror, right? Like it's just like basic logic, right? I don't want to say it's 2+2=4 simple, but like it's nearly that. Like once you've actually drawn the boundaries of the problem and really thought it through, like you come down to this question of like, are you going to let the thing draw from the distribution of weird maximalist outcomes or not? And the answer should probably be not, right? Like probably don't do that.
I mean, I wouldn't if I had a choice. It certainly seems helpful in getting better outcomes out of the thing. Um,
Right. And so you're going to end up teaching it on some level to care about both the process and the outcome, right? Now, how much do you teach it? How do you trade off those things? That will have to be like, that will be an ongoing process of discovery. How, does this mean that like, oh, if you don't trade it off all the way towards, if you don't give it any, if you give it any constraints on process, we're just doomed because some consequentialist will defeat it. That's just not clear to me, right? Like, for example, something like, say, Drexlerian nanotech seems well within a kind of thing that I could see humans doing right? Like even if its thing was just do things that are roughly like what reasonable, wise, not horrific, not like weird galaxy brain humans would do, who are smart and want good things to happen. I could easily see building, say, like some kind of like nanotech enabled, benevolent surveillance system, right? Like anything of that nature. Like
But
it's just not.
I want to clear up that I worry this is a bit of a straw man around the claim of outcompete. Um, so, as I understand it, obviously, I think if you have a sufficiently large lead or like buffer, right, in some sense to work with, right, you got there the first disk with the most compute and the most trading techniques and blah blah blah, then you can give some of that back in some sense, right? Like you can sacrifice some amount of performance to get other things you want. And certainly, like if you're the first, the recursive self-improvement prize, then what you do afterwards can be rather inefficient and it won't matter very much. And then you don't have to worry so much about the technical fact that like your implementation is somewhat less efficient. If you're in a different kind of situation where you are in fact competing on a more level playing field, then you have to worry about these things quite a lot more. And so, you have to worry about kind of what kind of universes you're setting up for humanity and AI to whether or not this kind of trade-off becomes viable and to what extent. But
Sure.
yeah, so I just wanted to like, make
No,
that
no, that's.
like,
So I
everybody
think
agrees
like
that like if you make everyone agrees if you have the only AI that gets to recursive self-improvement or is vastly better than everybody
sure,
else.
I'm not talking. To be clear, I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about that. I just mean like normal. I mean just mean like a normalish multipolar scenario that you could extrapolate from like the current trajectory. I'm not actually talking
Right, and the
about like.
question is like how much of a hit are you taking for? I mean, like obviously, like you can't not pay the alignment tax, right? Like that's not an option. You can't pay something. You have to do something.
So it is right, and so I think basically my expectation is that it's ironically enough, like in part because of the orthogonality thesis, the alignment tax that you pay in practice will look like I think that people expect like, oh, if you have like a scare quote normative AI, you're paying at least like an 80% alignment tax, and therefore in any kind of multipolar scenario you'll be outcompeted. I think that you're paying more like a 1% alignment tax or something, where it just ends up in practice just being swamped by other factors like who supports who or what resources are devoted to which projects, or especially if you're in a scenario where like your central input to the goodness of the AI is compute. Because I just don't like even say like, let's say you're building it in like a distributed fashion where you have thousands and thousands of nodes or like millions of nodes even distributed all across the world in some kind of like distributed crypto whatever architecture you want to imagine. That's still going to be using like a substantial fraction of available compute resources. It's just like a difference of like governance basically. And so you're still looking at like people are supporting whatever project with this expected design and values and outcomes. And over time, right, like the substrate of that, where right now all of our computation is being done on these relatively insecure platforms and computers, like the minute you have an AI that has any kind of like, and this is already happening, right, with ChatGPT, and like I'm sure that we're not that far away from like it just being expected that before you do any kind of like code check-in, that you're going to have AIs that are checking it for problems, and then the next step beyond that will be like having AI systems reduce the labor cost of formal verification of software, right? Where you're going to be saying like, look, I want to like use like these stronger type systems, but I don't want to make my software cost 100 times as much. Can you help me out, ChatGPT? And ChatGPT, especially if you're in like a felicitous feedback loop where people start demanding some more of this, and that means the AI is having more training data to work with and get better at doing that. That if you start a loop like that that's self-reinforcing, you can end up with like a substrate that is becoming more secure and less vulnerable to like weird takeover from like malicious actors over time. But more importantly, my point is that like no matter like I don't see any development trajectory, barring like some advance where like, oh, suddenly like you can just make things orders and orders of magnitude more efficient. Like, oh, suddenly you can just like you're getting like a 4 order of magnitude increase of performance overnight, which I don't see in the technology's future. Like the longer I think about it, I just don't see like that kind of performance enhancement on the table. You're going to be looking at a scenario where the winning systems are in one way or another going to be made out of a substantial fraction of the planet's compute resources, right? You're looking like whether they're distributed and open source, whether they're like, because even for things that are like an open model, right? It does not like if you were to open source the GPT-4 weights, you still have to pay for like an 8 times box to run it, which is, like that's achievable. But then, you get to like GPT-5, let's say it's 10 times bigger. Well, now you need like a small cluster of boxes to run this. And like, but even those AIs, right? Like if I'm thinking realistically, I do not expect GPT-5 to like on its own, right, to be like so much like one of the things that stands out to me is that like at OpenAI's Dev Day, they're not really like, oh yeah, we're having like our next models, and like the actual capital requirements of scaling up seem to have like this weird curve where it's almost like you need like if you want to keep scaling past this, it's almost like you need like government intervention to like throw more money in. Like Anthropic claims in their investment slides that they're going to use the money to build something 10 times bigger than GPT-4. It's like, okay, well, are you then going to build something 10 times bigger than that? And then like if you do that, you're going to like one thing I would ask is like, what do you think the actual like return curve is on further investment? Because OpenAI hasn't actually published like any details about their GPT-4 training run, we don't even know if the curve is broken yet at the GPT-4 level, right? Like when you train a GPT-4 level model, does the scaling curve still imply, or does the loss curve imply that you could still make it better and get bigger results? And how much better would those results be? This is not known information. And you might argue like, well, maybe it shouldn't be known information. Like, fine, but like it still means we don't know. But my expectation would be that like the actual level where you're getting to like scare quote world takeover type or extinction risk level AI, I don't think that's like, oh, that's one more 10 times over GPT-4. That's 2 more 10 times. I would imagine that's like orders of magnitude, right? That's at least like, and I think this is like one of the cruxes or like points of contention. I remember Lear and Shapiro was arguing about this. He said, the only reason GPT-4 isn't, and by the way, Connor Lee has also said like similar things where he says essentially like, but I'm talking about Lear and exact statement because it's like public. He says something like, the only reason that GPT-4 is not like an extinction risk right now is it can't boss people around. And that was why I was asking, like, why doesn't AutoGPT work, right? Because that seems like a very important part of the FRET model here. And if you have any thoughts, by the way,
I don't think it's true that if GPT-4 could boss people around, that it would be an extinction event. I can imagine, in theory, if you arrange the humans such that they attach certain social position to even a relatively dumb system, right? This is kind of the plot of Daemon, for example. You can, in fact, effectively use human intelligence as part of the AI system to like generate whatever event you want in some important sense. But, if we actually think about what it would take, like my sense is that a GPT-5 metaphorical, 1 or 2 order of magnitude above GPT-4, about as much better as GPT-3, et cetera, et cetera. I think of that as like 1/9 of safety in terms of like whether it's big enough for an potential event. Right? Like I would bet heavily against it, but like I'm not thrilled that we're finding out.
That sure. Okay, I think that's like is that my position? Not quite, but like I think that's like a fair position. Like it's not like an intrinsically crazy position. Like okay, so I think this is actually a good, because we only have about 30 minutes left, and I think this is actually a good point to kind of maybe transition a bit. But real quick, maybe a 5-minute point, because I wanted to talk about this more, but then we ended up talking about outer alignment. I went in expecting to talk about inner alignment, but instead we talked about outer alignment. But just to talk about inner alignment really quick, like most of the like deceptive Mace optimize, like there's this like weird fallacy people engage in where they'll talk about like deceptive alignment, but they never actually discuss. And actually, this does lead into the next thing I wanted. Like, they'll never discuss like where exactly they expect the deception to come in, right? And so because of that, you'll get like this weird thing where people will talk like we can just assume deception happens, and we can just basically we start from the assumption that it's misaligned and that there is deception somewhere, and it does not matter how much you're like a thing addresses the core causes or roots or like latent variables which cause misalignment, we just keep assuming the same amount of like intrinsic misalignment risk. There's like this weird like failure to update of like, there is a range of like probabilities for how risky it is if something is misaligned based on this training process, but there's actually no update that occurs. Like I can present, basically my intuition is that I could present something like Nate Soares with the same alignment plan, with 8 different variations of an alignment plan, one of which has like a very strong risk of, deceptive Mace optimizer type outcomes, and one of which has almost no risk of that, but that he will grade them all about equally risky. Or maybe he'll like differentiate between ones that are like really obviously bad ideas and the other ones that are merely bad ideas because they don't conform to like his personal weird specific biases.
Nate is probably the most skeptical grader of alignment plans on the planet, or at least very, very far up there. And the expectation is if you gave him 100 alignment plans, he would grade them all as impossibly doomed to fail. And then if you asked him to differentiate exactly how doomed to fail, some of them would be slightly less doomed, but yeah. My way of thinking about this, as I've thought more and more about AI and how these things work, has evolved towards like this idea of like these models are misaligned and like they're being deception, as to almost dissolve these words in my brain to a large extent. Like they're not pointing at like really important things, but that like this idea that something would have had to, in some sense, have gone wrong in order to like misalign or see deception. You have to point to like what caused that, as opposed to it simply being, what anything that was trying to gradient descent on outcomes and like do whatever seemed likely to work was going to do. I mean, any child you've ever seen is going to sometimes realize that saying that which is not is helpful here.
Let me be a little clearer about what I mean here. What I mean here is that like I think that for a long time, alignment meant outer alignment, right? When what we now call outer alignment, it meant specifying a goal function and training process that will in theory at least produce a aligned or at least not catastrophic agent that is still like capable.
Right. You want the outcomes to be non-catastrophic, to be what you ideally what you want.
Catastrophic. And then over time, I've noticed a shift away from that, where it's become about like paranoia about, well, there may be like a consequentialist agent foundation's homunculus sitting inside your weights, waiting to spring on us once. And this is like, to me, this is like an absolutely terrible development in the AI alignment field, and that it's like getting it far away from like, to me at least, are like the central, obvious, still frankly relevant threat models towards this like weird obscuritin. And so when I'm talking about this, I'm not trying to invalidate like when you say like, for example, the default is we should assume it's misaligned. That's not what I'm saying, right? Like, or even like, the default is that like, it's not so much why do you expect it to go right versus why you expect it to go wrong. It's not even like that. I'm talking specifically about the idea of like, there's like this weird thing where like you would present someone like Nate Soares with an alignment plan, and his criticism would not be based on, for example, how do you ensure that you're pointing at the right thing? His criticism would mostly be based on, or at least like the now default criticism, and what I was kind of seeing in like the Dworkesh interaction with like Eliza Yudkowsky and Liren Shapiro quote tweeting it, was something like, well, it doesn't matter if you specified a correct ethical objective, because the homunculus inside the weights is still going to pwn you, okay? You're still going to get screwed over by the little consequentialist inside who is sitting there and waiting and plotting your demise, as opposed to like, something like, for example, like in my yes spammer bug.
Okay, that's not. I think I have enough to try and see if I can intuition pump here and maybe point you in a direction that would be productive. So when I think of Dworkesh's question on deceptive alignment in the situation, it's not that like the AI is actively, thinking to itself, well, I have to pretend to be ethical. Like, it's sort of a way of describing in like simpler or more intuitive terms to a lot of people, something that is more like, well, what are you teaching what is the outer alignment optimizer or whatever we want to call it. Like, what are we actually telling it? We're telling it to do that which is evaluated by the evaluation function, which can be a human, can be an AI, can be some hybrid of them, whatever, as following these ethical principles, right? Like that's
Sure.
what we're aiming for. And so the idea is that like if the AI is insufficiently powerful in some very sense, it has not enough optimization going on, the only reasonable solution to this problem that can be found by its training is to actually embody these principles, right? Like nothing else, anything else it's going to do is going to backfire horribly. And so any attempt to move in those directions will just fail.
Right, sure.
However, the idea being that, if it gets sufficiently sophisticated and complex and capable and intelligent and blah, 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 and this thing gets trillions of parameters and we scale it up and up and up, and we give it lots and lots of more training run, that it will start to, discover paths through output space or whatever you want to call it, that give the impression to the evaluation function that it's fulfilling its ethical parameters without, but that stops matching the actual ethical parameters, right?
Sure. So I understand what you're saying. Now, I just want to get really frank. So I'm just going to get really frank here. My specific criticism is that my expectation is that if I were to say, you will learn the process and the outcome, not just the outcome. And so the AI will have attachment, it will value both aspects of the process or like meta principles of process, as opposed to just finding the most efficient solution in whatever space. That the answer I would get back is no, it won't, because the consequentialist homunculus inside is going to just ignore the process training, no matter how much of it you give, because gradient descent is because there's this weird, absolutely bizarre evolution metaphor that is not how gradient descent works, right? Gradient descent is like a system that works on both the process and the outcome.
Well, no, like the human, as I understand it, right, the human brain has some very interesting machinery in it, right? Where if I were to act ethically, right?
Sure.
I am training myself to be ethical, right? In those
ways. And my argument is basically that this is more or less the kind of thing that gradient descent does in general. But that's not right. But we both agree that that's not on its own sufficient in the case of limiting process, that there are circumstances where that is not necessarily in of itself sufficient, right?
Right, and so essentially, when I see claims like this from people who are making much worse, less detailed arguments than you are, right? Like I often see this confusion of assuming that kind of property that we see in humans will, for metaphorical similar reasons, hold on computers that just don't have this kind of leaky.
Right. So I don't see this as happening for metaphorical. Just specifically the way that gradient descent happens to work, it happens to share half of this property.
Right. So your belief about the details of exact gradient descent is that it will effectively mimic this property somewhat. And so would you call this it gets stuck at local maxima, where it embodies these?
Yeah, right. So that's the thing, right? And so when you talk about a local maxima, it depends, right? So if you have a thing, so here's an example of a thing you can do. Here's a training process that, to get into really subtle details, let's say you have a training process where more like the traditional RLHF setup. I have a reward model. I have an AI. I have a prompt bank. I prompt the AI in some scenario or context. I then grade its response through a reward model, right? And then I update the AI based on the reward model. Part of what I'm trying to say here is that if all you have is just that one reward model and you're that's a frozen reward model, you're not learning to, you're not at you can think of the reward model as your utility function, right? That's your value function. And so if I do this and then I learn all these behaviors, right, that are aligned, they probably are aligned. But here's where it gets interesting, right? Is if you imagine scaling this up and doing this process with a much smarter model, like you say, if it has any context where it's prompted to act consequentialist or think in a consequentialist way, or it's in a process, say a civilizational competition where it's prompted to think in a more consequentialist way, those behaviors will start to break down precisely because, for the same reasons that the yes spammer bug happens, right? There is a gradient pointing to the scare quote real maximum of the reward model. And there's a smooth gradient. In the case of the yes spammer, there's a smooth gradient there, right? yes, saying the word yes or a couple of yeses is like completely, by the way, I just realized we may not have explained to our list, the yes spammer is essentially a bug where like, if you have this reward model, it just says like yes or no to wherever some piece of text satisfies a property and it's all in like one context, you can sometimes break the model by just spamming the word yes instead of anything that the content should actually be about. And the model will hear yes, 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 and then predict the next word is yes. And this is like a problem. But when you have like that bug, right, it's completely continuous behavior with normal behavior. So there's like a failure mode. You have a very slight failure. This slight failure is like reinforced. And like, but when you think about like what you were talking about with like, if you were talking to a human would push back and say, no, stop saying yes all the time. So stop that. But what happens with, and so if you were to learn, if you're like, imagine while you were doing this setup, right, this whole training loop, that you also had like a second prompt bank sort of that you're learning, where you're learning like what it should look like to answer these questions correctly, or like you're learning like aspects of like the way you're answering that are good and adding them to a second reward model that's like updated along with the training, along with the underlying model itself. And then that reward model, which remembers what naive aligned behavior is supposed to look like, then intervenes and says, stop saying yes all the time. That's not what aligned behavior, that's not what good behavior looks like. That's just some weird OOD. This does not rescue the phenomenon of the original naive things you were learning earlier. Basically insisting that like the behaviors you learn should be somewhat consistent in their form, at least consistent enough in their form over the run that you don't just suddenly have like a weird discontinuity where you jump the rail and now you're spamming yes all the time, or sticking electrodes into people's heads without their consent, or things of this nature. And so when you're but like naively, right? If we're not doing that and we're just doing the frozen reward model trained on like thumbs up, thumbs down, it can even be an online reward model, right? Like you said, if you have all the humans in all the world giving feedback to this AI, pressing thumbs up, thumbs down, but like all the AI cares about is like, getting that loop. Like that loop will break down precisely because it does not have like a valued memory of the original phenomenon that it's trying to capture, that it has value attached to it. It only cares about like this very narrow, potentially hackable correlate of the underlying thing it's trying to learn. And so the difference I'm saying is that if you just do that naive thing where you're not learning like a separate process model in addition to your outcome model, that as you scale that up and as you take that to the limit, it's very well the case that you could see like these, like outcomes where, well, this satisfies the terminal reward. That's all you asked me to do. You're not actually like forcing me to rescue the phenomenon in any kind of way. You're not forcing me to like make my actions consistent with a naive sense of them. So as I get smarter and smarter, I'm just going to like find more and more cursed ways to good heart your reward model, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think we went over a lot of that before. I think
We did, but I was just kind of recapping
some,
it maybe
some,
because
some listeners will definitely need that. Right. I think a lot of my perspective on this is that like it's very easy to have enough optimization pressure, right? To have enough, capability to find just spam yes, or to drift towards just spam yes, right? Like it's a
sure.
relatively simple
Right. Yeah,
target.
that's right. That's not, you do not need to be smart to do that.
Right. And so it's very easy to see this, and we already see this. And if you were to incorporate process evaluators and you were to incorporate like common sense checks on the composition of your outputs and such, you can stop the thing from drifting towards such an obviously flawed target, right? Like, and then you need a much more, and then the question is there going to be another less obvious, more complex failure mode, right? It's like the kind of thing that would fool humans or would fool whatever your secondary checks are, that is still like a perverse outcome that we didn't want. And we
Well,
haven't
so
really
basically,
defined it.
if you're continuously adding to the instrumental reward store, right? So this is like a continuous process that you do like at the start of the training run when your model is relatively naive, and you're still doing it like all the way through the training run. Part of the idea is that like the evolution of the instrumental checks should evolve like with the like the instrumental checks should like evolve along with the model getting smarter, which should like help avoid that. Like, yeah, okay, sure, that would have fooled me when I was merely human level, but it doesn't fool me at super intelligence level 119 minus one or whatever.
So
That's
it's a
like
form
kind of,
of iterated checks on the system, but like it's incorporated.
something of that nature. Now, is that perfect? Is that like a thing that like is going to have no failure? No, of course not, right? So you're going to obviously have like various things you're going to be looking, and it's like, might say like, well, how could you ever know like whether you can capture all of the possible like, how do you know if you're ever going to like iron out all the failure modes? And part of the answer might just be like, you might not have to. Like basically, when we talk about something that's scare quote super intelligent, does it actually need to have like complete unnormative freedom to find whatever solution it wants? Like I can imagine a set of AIs, or for example, like to avoid like triggering like the dystopia people, like like a distributed singleton, right? That's run across like many computers that have been nearly perfectly secured, such that you would already need to be like as super intelligent as the whole system to destroy, to hack them, or anything like that. I could easily imagine a system of that nature, which is aware of, because again, like the orthogonality thesis means that one of its consequences is that the complexity of the thing that implements the strategies and tactics does not necessarily have to be like, or rather the normativity of that does not necessarily have to be like the normativity of the goals. And like, like obviously they're related in this scheme because you're trying to teach it both process and outcome, but like the limit of like reasonable non-OOD process does not have to look like so stupid that it's like not capable of defending itself against other systems that would try to like bootstrap themselves and like destroy it, right? Like especially if you're in
Yeah, I mean,
a
I think
scenario.
we're granting, for the sake of exploring the possibility space, that like we don't have to worry about that stuff for now. We're simply trying to ask the question, can we get from A to B? Can we scale up in a way that doesn't cause these crazy outcomes to happen? And then each of these steps, right? We're continuously adding new terms, new aspects to our core value, right? Like we're incorporating these process considerations.
So real quick, just because I want to like, do you agree, just in principle, that like if you have a system where you're actually trying to like trade off process values versus like outcome values, that this would in fact like, at least in principle, help mitigate, like basically, if I like were to ask you about this later, are you gonna like pull the consequentialist homunculus card on me, right? Like you'll say, oh well, like I didn't actually say that, like I'm still, my still primary threat model is still like deceptive mace optimizers, and I don't feel like you address this, and and I do feel like obviously we should be on the lookout for deceptive mace optimizers. We should be looking to understand the internals of these networks more, but like,
So so to be clear, like that was not going to be my response to that question at all, right? If we had explored that path more, it was going to be a question of, well, that's an interesting idea. It certainly makes it hard to go off the rails. But I noticed that like we're doing this loop of modifying our ultimate functions that we're aiming for, and how do we make sure that doesn't go off the rails during this process in a way that like leads to something interesting? And here's several things that I'd be worried about here. This seems like a very hard path, but like I'm interested in talking about it. Would be my response.
it was about this point that I realized we only had 15 minutes. And instead of taking that as my cue to gracefully wind down the podcast and start giving an outro, I started talking faster, which is kind of an anti-pattern, right? That not a great idea. And this meant that the last maybe 15 or 20 minutes of the podcast ended up substantially lower quality than the rest of it. So rather than like leave the audience on that note on like a down note, I figured no, just, during the editing, I just end it here. My three takeaways from this conversation are: one, I think this is pretty good. On the object level, I would like to see fewer criticisms like, we don't know how to point an AI at anything, which is just kind of patently untrue at this point, and more criticisms like ZVI's,
I observe that this thing you're doing sounds like it has a fairly complex feedback loop, and I'm skeptical about the stability of that loop under XYZ conditions. That's like a much, that's a better discourse pattern. My second takeaway is that the frame I kind of stumbled on here about, if you boil down what, if you boil down what you care about in terms of like preventing the perverse instantiation, you end up with like a necessary trade-off between normative reasoning in your AI system and like pure consequentialist reasoning. The idea being that if you just have a system that finds the most efficient solution to reaching some outcome, that without some form of normative ethics, this is just going to obviously go badly. And that most of what we're concerned about, I think, is something closer to risks from super consequentialism rather than risks from super intelligence per se. And it's just kind of assumed that those go together, which like under many incentive schemes you could imagine they do. I think pretty much everyone agrees that super consequentialism is dangerous, or at least has the potential to be dangerous. And so I think maybe a better argument would be about under what circumstances that can or does arise. My third and final takeaway is that both before and after this podcast, me and ZVI recognized a kind of mutual frustration with the discourse as it exists. And rather than say, hey guys, play nice, because like that's not really going to change anything, right? I think I might tentatively suggest that there should be more peer discussion and maybe a little bit less like I think the failure modes that I observe come mostly from discussions between either an expert or an activist and the public, or a discussion between like one side of advocacy and another side of advocacy. Like you can't really do deep thinking in an adversarial context. It just doesn't really work. And so I think that if you want to see more deep thinking, you should probably encourage more peer discussion. I tried to talk to ZVI during this podcast as more of a peer than an opponent. I hope that came through. And thank you for listening.